All right, so we've seen something now, the connection between the lungs and the heart of the planet. Let's come back to the city and come back to a place and a part of the city, of the cityscape that is very dynamic for innovation, where the stories are quite astonishing. And this would be mobility, how we get around. How many in this room have rented a zip car or some other kind of vehicle like that? Okay, the shared economy. How many have done an Uber or a Lyft? Okay, almost everybody. How many have ridden in a bike lane? So you are getting around in different ways than were available just a few short years ago. Bikes have been around for a long time, but designated bike lanes is a trend that's really growing. And as we heard earlier from some of the mayors, actually something that pays off in ways that a lot of people didn't imagine. How will we get around our cities as they grow? How do we get around cities like Tucson and Phoenix and San Antonio and LA that sprawl, hopelessly sprawl? Well, now time for a couple of student stories. So what's old again is new again, and what's been around for a long time becomes an innovation, and I'm talking about rails here. Rails, both in the city and connecting cities. So we have two students. The first student pitch comes from right here, GW, Connor Ferry. Is Connor in the room? Connor's over here. And our other student is Nathaniel right here. Okay? He'll introduce himself on tape. I'll let it roll.
The DC streetcar began operations on February 27th of this year. It is still very much a work in progress as we have plans to extend the system to the Benning Road Metro Station on the east and to the Georgetown waterfront on the west. The population in Washington, D.C. continues to grow. There are projections out there that say we're going to be approaching 1 million residents in the not too distant future, and it's going to be incredibly important for us to find ways to provide additional transit options, ways for people to get around.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Weiner, a student at Middlebury College. It's been more than 60 years since passenger rail has come down these tracks, allowing students to take the train to Middlebury instead of cars. I met with senior architecture students to hear about the implications for rail returning to Middlebury.
I think that students will use it a lot more to get into Burlington. Like, that's a given. People are going to be going back and forth all the time, which will be fantastic because not everyone has access to cars.
I think that Middlebury is this emerging town of entrepreneurial endeavors, and there's so much happening here, and there's so much opportunity for young people to come and be engaged in this town, and I think we need a portal that kind of represents that that's going on here.
Interesting is this. Here we're up in Vermont, and we're talking about in a rural place connecting cities, and here we are in DC in an established cities putting a streetcar back in. How's the streetcar doing, Connor?
Doing quite well, actually. They already have well over the estimated...
Give him a mic, give him the mic.
They already have well over the estimated ridership that they expected back in February.
It had some real problems getting launched, though, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It took a long time.
A lot of delays, a lot of cost overruns. And here's the problem with the DC streetcar. It's not in a dedicated lane. So if who've been to New Orleans or San Francisco, you've seen the streetcars there. Most of those will have dedicated lanes. You go to Europe, streetcars, they'll have dedicated lanes. So there's a lot of traffic. The streetcar moves. Here, if there's traffic, what happens to the streetcar?
It'll have to wait, and there have actually been a couple accidents already, so it's hard to deal with the traffic.
So it's off to a great start, except for the traffic and the accidents.
True.
So things are coming up, but what's really interesting in this corridor where it's running, it's already, and even before it was put in, it started generating new businesses and new activity. In Vermont, can we bring the mic down here quickly? So what's the deal here? We're looking at reconnecting cities. When was the last time there was rail traffic there?
The last time there was rail traffic was, I believe, in the 1950s. It was ended because of a rail strike. So actually we had passenger rail workers who didn't show up to their jobs, And because of that reason, rail pretty much ended in most of the cities and towns in northern Vermont.
And if it goes back, it would connect.
If it goes back, it'll connect Rutland, which is currently where rail goes to from New York City, all the way up to Burlington, which is the Queen City of Vermont.
And the hope is this will take people out of cars or just provide an
The hope
alternative?
is it'll take people out of cars. The hope is it'll bring public transit back to the state. The biggest obstacle right now is the rails are there. They're used for commercial and freight purposes. However, the rails have to be welded in order to be used for passenger transit.
Okay, so rails are just one way. Thanks, Nathaniel. I appreciate it. To both of you guys, how about a round of applause? Both of these guys submitted for the StoryFest Award, so thank you very much for that. So from rail, slow speed, high speed, to Uber and to other kinds of technologies, how do we get around the city if we're not only going to use cars or if we're going to displace cars? Well, we have an experienced conductor with us today to navigate this transportation role here a little bit, this transportation innovation, we hope. And we're going to ask him to come out. And we worked with Cooper Martin at our Planet Forward Summit salons. We have a few of these salons over the course of the year where we kind of get to know people and we talk about some of these issues and figure out how we're going to frame these things up when we come out here. So Cooper is the program director of the Sustainable Cities Institute at the National League of Cities. He believes passionately in this stuff, and we're going to turn transportation over to him. So Cooper, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. And I heard, I didn't see all the hands raised in the audience when Frank was just asking about how many people have taken Zipcar, taken Uber, ridden a train. In our role at the National League of Cities, we try to get a lot of data and gather a lot of data, and people have done this for a long time, trying to do transportation planning. And the data is getting a little bit fuzzier. So I want you to think about your primary mode of transportation, whatever it is you use the most, whether it's a bike, public transportation, or a car. And now I want to see a show of hands. How many people in this room use that mode of transportation 100% of the time? Nobody. How many think they use it more than 80% of the time? So a few hands. This is one of the problems that's vexing a lot of planners right now. Now I want to see a show of hands. How many of you in the last 2 weeks have made a trip that involved more than one mode of transportation? You started on a bike, you transferred to something else. Almost everybody. So planners have no way of modeling that, actually. It's interesting. And when you ask in survey data how to get how to build a transportation plan, you're usually asking people about their predominant mode of transportation in order to figure out where those trips are being generated. But now, as we've just seen, many people are using that predominant mode of transportation less and less. And this is something that's challenging to a lot of planners, challenging to a lot of city leaders. And I know we've got a pretty rambunctious and entertaining panel who's going to talk about some of these challenges, the ways that their cities or companies are addressing these issues and transportation innovations, trying to build more sustainable, more connected cities. So with that, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. We'll go a little bit in alphabetical order. The first is the Honorable Tommy Battle, the mayor of Huntsville, Alabama. The mayor is in his second term, and I understand is a veteran of these Planet Forward summits here, so returning to the stage. We also have Julie Felger, the Managing Director of Environmental Strategy and Integration at Boeing Commercial. Certainly one of the largest companies in the nation when it comes to transportation. Next we have Megan Smith, who is the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives for King County, Washington. And we'll get into the geography of King County in a little bit. Next we also have Shibag Genisan, who is a junior majoring in geography and environmental studies from Middlebury. Particularly interested in transportation and equity, and we'll dive into that problem both today and I know in a panel later this afternoon. And rounding out our panel is Colin Tews, who is the Director of Public Affairs for Uber Technologies. One of those cars some of you may have ridden in just this past weekend. So with that, we'll get started. I'll come and join you guys. We are squeezed in here. You warned me about that.
Like on a plane, you want the smallest person next to you.
So because I'm with the National League of Cities, I obviously have a bias towards cities, and we're gonna lead it off with our municipal leader here. And really my question, when it comes to Huntsville, Alabama, it's a relatively large city, but it's growing very rapidly. And I once heard another rapidly growing city talk about the decision to transfer from being kind of a big town mentality and thinking of themselves more in terms of a small city and what that means for its transportation planning. And I wonder if you can speak to that and some of the transportation initiatives that you've started since becoming mayor. I know you've directed your planning department to look into this.
Your biggest thing is to realize that you have to have an integrated plan. Your plan has to include automobiles and roadways, but it also has to include pedestrian. It has to include the bike trails. And then it has to go on to become almost an ecosystem. When we recently had Uber added to the mix, really added to the ecosystem of what we had transportation-wise, because all of a sudden you had a very reliable system. We had a taxi cab system, now we have Uber, and so we added to that ecosystem so that you have a reliable system that people can depend on. You take that and add the transit element into it, and as you start adding, it's very interesting to see the consequences of adding all that to your system. How many more parking spaces do you need downtown? How much more can you do on urban environment? How much more can you pack into one area? And how much more density can you add? And as you add all that, and then you look at what's coming in the future, and especially as mayors, our job is to look 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead. What happens when we have the driverless car come in? What happens to the family that used to have 2 cars, and now they have 1 car? And if they have 1 car, then I don't have to build them a parking space that costs me $15,000. So all of it kind of ties together, and it's an ecosystem that is a very big ecosystem that makes your community be able to have a transportation plan that addresses everybody.
That's great, and hopefully we'll come into some of the specifics as the panel goes on, but I want to transfer from Huntsville to a company that I know has a little bit of a presence in Huntsville now from our time backstage, and ask, Julie, we know you've been working particularly on sustainability, both in terms of the company and the airline industry, but also specifically with SeaTac and the airport and the operations of airports themselves to become more sustainable as hubs, as campuses, as places. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that, and I know you've talked a little bit about changing demographics and changing demand, and just tell us what's Boeing thinking in terms of all of this?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that 2 key points that have been brought up today are related to setting goals for yourself and then how you collaborate and how you integrate. And Mayor Battle just mentioned that. So when aviation looks at what we're going to do to reduce our environmental footprint and increase our environmental performance, I would say, we first initially set some pretty ambitious goals for ourselves. And the first is to go carbon neutral as an industry. Now this is on our airplane products by 2020. And the second is by 2050 to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% based off of a 2005 baseline. Now those are really ambitious goals. And typically, in the aerospace industry, you do have some of the smartest people in the world working together to achieve those things. Think of going to the moon and putting all that effort and time together and all the technology together to get up there. But our industry right now is actually, if you look at our emissions, we're 2% of carbon emissions worldwide, and our goal is to get that down 50%. But if we were a country, we would be the 8th largest emitter of CO2 in the world. And that is why we as an industry have these collective goals, and we're working collaboratively together. Also, our facilities, we're looking at 0 growth goals for all of our facilities, and we've got facilities both in King County and in Huntsville. So how are we going to do that? First of all, we're looking at technologies that relate to our products. Think of the 787 airplane. That airplane is 20 to 25% more efficient than the airplanes that it is replacing in the skies today. And we did that by looking at the use of materials like composites to make that airplane so much lighter so that you don't have to use as much fuel. It also helps, by the way, that that's one of the most comfortable airplanes to ride. If you haven't had an opportunity to do it, it's a great airplane. Also, it gives you such range that you can go single city pairs, so you don't actually have to fly from London to Washington, D.C. to get to Indiana. You can go Heathrow to Indiana directly. That saves on fuel when you're doing that. The second piece is related to operational efficiency. So air traffic management networks, and how can we get the world to upgrade air traffic management networks so that you can actually reduce the time that airplanes spend in the sky today? One of the compelling statistics is that if you could reduce the 20 million flights by 1 minute each, you would save over $1.5 billion in fuel use every single year. That relates to millions and millions of tons of carbon emissions reductions. But you have to work together with the governments and the industry and the airlines to get that done. Third, and you mentioned this related to CTAC, is biofuels. We're looking at sustainable alternative biofuels, so think third or fourth generation biofuels. And what we mean by sustainable is we don't want them to compete with crops and food use. We don't want there to be a negative water use related to that, and we want to ensure that we're looking at the sustainable development of the societies where you're actually creating these feedstocks to be used for fuels. And that's a 50 to 80% life cycle emissions reduction if we can change the fuels that we use on the airplanes. So we're doing all of that. And then, of course, as mentioned by Gina McCarthy up here earlier, we work on policy mechanisms around the world, both at a multilateral level, as well as a global level, as well as a local level. And we look at this as an entire system. So if you're familiar with ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, they're working on a market-based measure which will mean that your emissions will be offset by the airlines as you fly. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be able to travel. I kind of polled this panel, 1, 2, 3, 4 people flew here. You want to fly, but you want to do it in a way that you feel responsible in doing it. And so our goal is to ensure that we create the most efficient products possible and create the best collaborations possible over time to help us reduce that environmental footprint.
Yeah, and I know it's something I think about all the time just as a manager of a sustainability program, how much I myself have to travel and whether I need to make those trips on an airplane. So it's definitely true and interesting too how much you can accomplish at scale. So some dizzying statistics there. And Megan, I want to turn to you because you've really got an interesting perspective in King County, everything from downtown Seattle and the transit environment and ecosystem that's there, all the way out to more rural parts of the county, and it's one of the largest counties in the country. And I'm interested just in the dynamics of what types of modes of transportation are possible and what you see from each of those cities, whether they're small or large, trying to figure out the next transportation investment out in Washington.
Okay. Well, I'll say a few things about King County itself, just to give you a little background. We're the 13th or 14th largest county in the country. We have about 2 million residents right now. We have 39 cities in our county, and they range from very large Seattle, which most people have heard of, down to very small cities in the eastern part of the county that are more rural. And when you were talking about having an ecosystem, Mayor Battle mentioned that's something we need in King County as well to serve all those interests. And we also have to make sure we're working at the right scale. So for things like light rail, we are doing it on a regional Puget Sound scale. So we're going to have a ballot measure this fall that would support building 108 miles of light rail. That's coming up. We also have our King County Metro Transit providing transit bus services. We have the largest van pool fleet in the country. So we have many people. We partner with employers to get people into those van pools. We partner with employers on commute trip reduction programs, so people get employee bus passes. So we build that ecosystem. We are getting more and more interest and demand from folks who live in the more rural cities, who typically have had more of a suburban environment, relying on a single occupancy vehicle, saying, I want to have access to transit too. So then you start thinking about, are you going to put the big articulated bus out there, or are you going to put some kind of a van service out there? So we really have to build that ecosystem. Just one quick note I'll give from a climate change perspective. You were just mentioning the work you're doing with the airline industry as a whole and having shared goals. That's been very important to us as well in King County. We know that King County can do a lot on things like energy efficiency and transportation and land use, but we cannot do it alone. We've got to do it with our cities. So about 5 years ago, we created the King County Cities Climate Collaboration. We have 13 member cities that represent about 3/4 of our population. And the really exciting work we've been able to do over the last 2 years is set a meaningful shared emissions reduction target. So we have jointly said, We're going to reduce emissions 80% by 2050 with some measurement points along the way. And we are going to have a joint measurement framework and be transparent about our progress there. But there are a lot of pledges out there. Lots of city pledges, lots of county pledges. To me, it's not meaningful unless you take the next step to say, okay, what are our sources of emissions? How are we going to get there? What are the specific commitments? So we've done that as well. And a very big part of that is transportation and land use and thinking about mobility.
Yeah, and I want to give a quick shout out to King County as well for being part of the Compact of Mayors. I know you've taken steps to inventory and pass plans to reduce those emissions. So something that we've been working on at the National League of Cities as well. Turning to you now, Shubha, you've been asking a lot of questions and looking at a lot of cities, and what I guess the perspective that you bring to this is, what are you and students in your kinds of programs interested in seeing from cities? What are the questions that you're asking of the leaders who are here as they think about planning investments for transportation that are really designed to serve you and even people who are younger than you?
Right. So I actually talked to a lot of my friends before coming here, asked them, what are you interested in knowing about transportation? What's on your mind? And I think something that's at the top of a lot of people's priorities is understanding how we can make public transportation more equitable. So not only looking at things like, giving people alternatives to driving, but also thinking about, who doesn't necessarily have those options, who needs public transportation in order to get anywhere. We've also been really curious. I heard from a lot of people who wanted to know about how we can improve public transportation, like a couple of you mentioned, to more rural areas, especially since gentrification is such a problem in a lot of our cities, thinking about how we can really improve public transportation to be more accessible to everybody who needs it. I think that's something that's really at the forefront of a lot of students' minds in particular, because a lot of us are coming to this with a really critical perspective, and we're thinking we want to get involved in cities, we really want to help make our cities better, but we also want to know how to do it in the right way, and to understand better how people like mayors and other urban planners take into account the perspectives of everybody and are able to work with these multiple stakeholders.
And so have you already started to engage in that, or is that going to be something for a graduate thesis, perhaps?
It's definitely going to be part of my thesis, yeah.
Great. I'll look forward to reading that next year, maybe. Last, Colin, coming from Uber, it's something that, was a noun and not a verb just maybe 6 years ago. Thinking about just the evolution, it's since I've been in DC in 10 years, the evolution that's taken place in terms of the taxi commissions and the involvement of Uber. What are some of the challenges that you see in terms of getting into cities, making sure that you're providing transit options and even equitable transit options? Because I know that's been a big topic.
No, absolutely it is. I mean, one thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about is how to prepare for an ever more urbanized world. And so today, about 50% of the world's population live in cities. But in our lifetimes, by 2050, that's going to be 2/3 of the world's population. And so that raises a host of questions. How do we make sure that infrastructure is able to continue to meet the needs of those people? How do you move people efficiently around a city that's maybe 50% larger in a few decades than it is today? And we think part of the answer includes using technology and innovation to more efficiently move people around cities today in a way that can scale with the growth of cities. And so part of that answer involves getting more people in fewer cars. And part of it involves reducing incentives to private car ownership so that people have alternatives available to them. You talked about sort of the multimodal lives that people live. We see ourselves as one option among many in the over 400 cities that we operate in. And so there are a lot of exciting possibilities there. As far as reducing the amount of traffic that's on our already congested streets, we're seeing some really exciting results from Uberpool, which if people aren't familiar with it, it's sort of the marriage of Uber and carpooling. It allows, through technology, it allows people who are going from one part of the city and taking a similar trip to a similar destination to share the ride and split the cost of the trip. And in those 33 cities, just in the first 4 months of 2016, we've seen savings of over 90 million passenger miles, and that translates to a reduction of 1.8 million gallons of gasoline. And again, that's just the first quarter of the year, and we're still rolling that product out in more cities. So a lot of challenges ahead, but a lot of really exciting technology-driven solutions ahead as well.
Great. And before we turn this over to the audience, in the spirit of talking about innovation, I want to pose this question to the whole panel. I think one of the biggest innovations that's coming down the road that everyone's talking about is driverless cars, and it's been mentioned in this already. But there's a lot of different perspectives as to how that driverless technology impacts car ownership, impacts transit, impacts planning and development of cities, from turning parking lots into buildings or whatever. And I wonder if what your perspective is on the impact of this driverless technology on the sustainable growth of cities, and whether you see this as a force for good that can kind of take form naturally, or something that governments and cities really have to play a more active part in understanding how this is going to roll out and how this is going to impact everything. And so anyone can jump at that, but
from our side, it's going to have to be an integrated process, because what happens to the driverless car that's driving down there, and all of a sudden you have somebody who is using the bike lanes and coming down? Can they identify? Can they make sure that they don't get in the way or bother that person or the walker or the pedestrian walker and all that? We've got to integrate that, but in saying that, we have to look out 4, 5, 6, 7 years from now when driverless cars are available, and it's a game changer in the downtown areas. It all of a sudden, as I said, your parking becomes much less important in the downtown area. You have a much more dense urban area, and the driverless cars are going to be something that will drive our whole economy. You're going to have to make sure that you have a great geospatial grid, and if you have a good geospatial grid, you can make sure that everybody stays within. Now, what it does to Uber and Lyft and some of those, it may be that they end up being the cars of the future, and people actually don't own cars in the future. That they use the Ubers who will come by driverlessly, pick them up, and take them somewhere else. There's a lot of new technology coming out, and we as people who are forward-looking have to look forward to what the capabilities will be and the technologies will be that drive us.
Sure, jump on it.
Okay. So people ask me often about driverless cars. They're like, what do you think about this? Is this going to solve all our problems? And I guess the caution I would have there is we shouldn't lock in on a particular technology as an outcome and say, how are we going to get that technology? I think we have to keep sight of, and this is especially true for local governments, what is the place that we want to live in, and what do we care about? And what are the decisions we have to make about land use and the kind of buildings we have, and how we bring jobs into areas so people don't have to commute so far, and how we build out that mobility ecosystem. I have heard this saying from my boss and others over time that, in the past we said the transportation we build today is our land use of tomorrow. And the way I really think about it now is that the mobility, that ecosystem we build today, is our quality of life tomorrow. So I kind of see technologies like driverless car or battery buses, all these things, they are exciting opportunities. We should really be thinking about them, thinking about things like parking in a local government context, but we can't lose sight of what are the outcomes we want for kind of quality of life and mobility in the region.
Yeah. The other technologies, bike shares, electric bikes, things like that, all those have to play into the picture, and they all have to combine together to make us make wise decisions in the future.
I have a particular fascination with electric bikes. And I know, Uber is making significant investments. Do you care to speculate on any of the results of that investment, or what's next?
Yeah, that's pretty far outside my area of expertise. But I'll just say our focus, for as long as I can see, as long as I've been with the company, and as far as I can see in the future with the company, is just making sure that we're able to help people have safe, reliable, affordable rides. And then if with technologies like Uber Pool we can help take more cars off the road, then so much the better.
last comments before I turn it over to the audience? Or
From the aviation industry, we use autopilot. It works really well for us. I hope that you can learn what we do and put it into cars. I was on I-95 North Corridor this weekend, and it was gridlock on a weekend on a Sunday morning. And I was just sitting there thinking, because I think in terms of CO2, oh my gosh, all the fuel that's being burned while these cars are idling. There wasn't a problem. It was just how people were driving and putting on their brakes at various points that caused this ripple effect. And so I was thinking, I can't wait for automated cars to avoid that.
the dedicated automated lane. Everyone's just going at equal speed with no buffer in between. Well, we're already running a little bit short on time, but I do want to make sure that we get questions from the audience. And I know we've got some mic runners, so there's a whole cluster of questions right here in the middle. I don't know whose hand went up first. Yeah, the lady in the striped shirt. We'll start there.
So how would you integrate new technology? Oh, right. I'm
Sorry, Frank.
Cassandra from GW. How would you integrate technologies in local and urban transportation for use in long-distance transportation? Because outside of the Northeast, right now, there's a lot of urban areas with great public transportation, but then the second you want to leave that city, you generally have to take a car.
I'll just mention one thing we've seen in Florida that I think has some really exciting possibilities for other cities is there's a city called Altamont Springs, not too far from Orlando in Florida. And they recently entered into a public-private partnership with Uber, whereby any Uber trip originating and ending within the city limits will be eligible for a 20% subsidy. And so citizens are able to, again, maybe not drive their own car, maybe over time turn two-car households into one-car households if there's an alternative that is that much more affordable to them. But the exciting twist that they put on it is that the Altamont Springs light rail system, which is called SunRail, and it's throughout that part of Central Florida, is part of the picture here because the city turned that 20% subsidy into a 25% subsidy for any trip beginning or ending at a light rail station. So it's an additional incentive for people to turn to public transportation options that are already available in their community. And if they're taking a trip outside the city limits or commuting in, they don't have to drive a personal vehicle and park it somewhere, and they don't have to have that idle asset consuming more resources. So I think it's very early days in partnerships like that, but I think there's something there that I think is worth exploring in other places.
Your question is a great one, though. But I have a city, and next to me is another city of 40,000, and we're encompassed in a county. We're in a metropolitan planning area that is 2 counties, but then we have a state which is 67 counties. So how do you combine all those together and get them all working in the same way? And then how does the state of Alabama tie to Tennessee, to Florida, to Georgia, et cetera, et cetera? Your question is one of how do we work together for a consolidated plan that puts all those pieces together, and the best that they can get right now is we're going to take care of the urban areas, and because they have the density and they can afford themselves, but those rural areas sometimes are many times left out. So how do we jump from that to the other is the question mark that I think we're going to have to answer in the future politics of regionalism.
Well, I'm curious to turn this question on its head, and Shiva, as kind of an East Coast transplant, you've been here a few years. How do you and your friends think about that when you're talking about taking a trip to somewhere else on the East Coast? Does that factor in significantly into whether you even go to a certain place, as whether you can get around once you're there?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely something that we end up talking about a lot, especially coming from a rural place in Vermont. So at Middlebury, a lot of where you can go is dependent on who has a car. It's like very car-centric, which is like really hard for a lot of people, especially like being in college. Not everybody has a car. So I think that's definitely something that's on a lot of people's minds is like, what's a better way to do this? How do you get people from one place to another without needing a car? It's definitely something a lot of people are thinking about.
Great. So we have another question who is just behind.
Hi, I'm Jesse from GW. I'm a senior here. You guys talked a bit about reducing transportation, specifically this passenger sector of transportation, but the largest part of emissions within the transportation, within the aviation sector comes from shipping, not actually people flying, but planes that are transporting goods. So the fruit, hypothetically, if the fruit that was upstairs came from Whole Foods, that would have flown in from Latin America or California a few days ago. So for this question for Ms. Felger, is the aviation industry specifically doing anything to reduce emissions from the shipping sector of aviation?
Yeah, so we call it air freight or air cargo over time. Yes, as you go about renewing your fleet, the air cargo carriers like FedEx and UPS, they're constantly investing in renewing their fleet. They're also looking at what I mentioned earlier on the sustainable alternative biofuels. Is there what we would call a single battlefield fuel? One we're looking at is green diesel, which is today used in ground transportation, but we're looking at approving that through the fuel specification standards, also for air transportation, so that you can do that. But the best way to reduce CO2 emissions is fly the newer airplanes over time. And a lot of the airlines, I mean, right now Boeing's record books are at historic levels because airlines, not only is the industry growing by 50% over the next 20 years, but the airlines are constantly focused on fuel efficiency of the airplanes, because fuel is oftentimes their biggest single cost over time. At the very least, it's 35% even with low fuel prices. Imagine when those barrels went up to $120 a barrel, it was up to 75% of their cost. So there's this natural drive and DNA towards efficiency in the industry. It's a great question.
I don't want to ignore this side of the room. Were there any questions? Yeah, we have a lady in the pink.
Bobby Falls-Zeitler, GW grad. I'm interested in how King County committed to 108 miles of light rail. The Washington, D.C. metro region desperately needs more light rail, and we can't get that kind of commitment out of 3 different jurisdictions, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. It's a big victory to get 13 miles of light rail that will go from Prince George's County over to Bethesda, Maryland, and that took like 10 years of fighting. So how'd you do it?
Well, the answer is it took a really long time. It didn't happen as quickly as I think people would have liked. We've had voter initiatives on the ballot roughly once a decade since the 70s. So the first one actually passed in the mid-90s. Then we had another one kind of mid-2000s, and we have this one on the ballot in the fall. So we're not there yet, but we're at least we're in a place with our governments to agree on what should go on the ballot. Now that's out in the public review sphere for some refinement. But I think part of it is, you know, when we've polled people in King County about their concerns about quality of life, congestion is number one. So we've seen a doubling in delays in traffic and congestion in 5 years. We're one of the fastest growing areas in the country. I think it's people realizing, you know, our quality of life is really at stake. We're expecting 1 million people in the next 25 years in our region, which for the mega cities you were talking about this morning is not a lot, but that's a 30% increase for us. And I think people have come to the point where they're like, I don't want to live like this. I want a better quality of life. I'm willing to invest in these things. Just an anecdote, about a month ago, we opened a light rail station at University of Washington. It's an 8-minute trip now from downtown to Seattle to the university. We set records for people using that immediately. People really want that service, along with bus rapid transit. So.
Anyone else want to take any transit coming to the Huntsville region anytime, or?
You know, it's very interesting listening to the difference. You're in the stage where you've had that compaction, and we use that in our economic development. We say that we have an average 18-minute commute to work, 18-minute commute home. It's 36 minutes a day, and we said now if you move somewhere on the East Coast, West Coast, it's an hour each way coming back. So what are you going to do with an extra hour, 24 minutes of your life every day? And if we can give that back to you, and I hate to say I've used it against on some industry recruiting, but it is a quality of life issue that comes up on a day-to-day basis. And you've got to have, you know, light rail is something to consider. It doesn't fit into our model yet. Someday it may. But you've got to consider every component of it: the pedestrian, the bike, the capabilities of the Ubers and the transit systems, and your automotive traffic too. You've got to put them all together. It's got to be an ecosystem.
And yeah, I think that hand right there that just shot up pretty eagerly in the tan jacket.
So it seems like if the public waits for the private sector to just voluntarily adopt the kinds of sustainability programs that are really going to save the world from climate change or things like that, it's going to be very difficult for Boeing to go ahead and implement programs that would dip into its profitability, make it more difficult to compete with other companies in the space. Same with Uber, right? So generally the public has to set the rules against which all of the private sector competes on equal footing. It seems like a lot to expect companies to voluntarily adopt measures that would hurt their competitiveness. So would Uber and Boeing support a climate tax, a carbon tax?
Well, I'm not in a position to comment on endorsing that specific proposal, but I'll just say I think I'll challenge a little bit the premise of your question, which is that sustainability and corporate well-being are inherently at odds. I mean, I spoke about Uber Pool. We're not the only company, certainly in the private sector, certainly voluntarily recognizing that people expect more sustainable options available to them. And I think, it's not, we're in a different world now than we were, say, 20 years ago. I think people, consumers and companies that are providing services and goods to consumers have a shared understanding that a sustainable future is going to take a lot of hard work from both sides. And so, it's something we're committed to, not at the point of a gun, but because it's the right thing to do and because our customers are looking to us to provide those options.
Yeah, I would add on. I mean, for us, the work that we do on sustainability is viewed that it's good for our customers, it's good for our employees, it's good for our investors. They expect you to be investing in this today. And it's just the DNA of the company is all around innovation and all around improving efficiency over time. So I don't think that they're necessarily at odds, perhaps 20 years ago, but today they're not. And quite frankly, we sell our airplanes on the efficiency of those airplanes, the efficiency and the comfort over time. The other thing I would say is that we have this internal news network in Boeing that we have almost 180,000 employees. So it's a huge company. When we do stories about what we're doing related to environment, they're not only our employees, they're members of the community. We have a facility in Huntsville, we have lots of facilities in King County, but they want to see what you're doing is right. And even as part of our recruitment, our younger employees in particular are very hyper-focused on do they feel that the company is doing right by the community in which they serve. And then for Boeing, it's a very global company, so they're not at odds anymore. In fact, I think it's a great ven.
We've just run out of time, but I'll ask each of the panelists if they have one concluding thought. Is that going to be okay, Frank, or should we? All right. One concluding thought for innovation, sustainability, and transportation. You don't have to, but if there's anything else you wanted to get off your chest here or explain to the audience about your perspective, now's the chance to do it.
I think one of the things that was really impressive was the light rail. It took, decade after decade after decade to pull up the public support to be able to pay for that and to make it work. And all of us have to be educated, have to be moving forward, because you don't do anything in this world without a crowd behind you, without somebody supporting you and somebody making it happen. And that's part of what I think comes out of this today, is that the education of the public is that they need to understand that everybody has to work on different planes and in different places for a better ecosystem of transportation. And as we do that, you have to pull your public support behind you. And y'all did a great job of it for over 40 years. It took you 40 years to pull it up. But it does take a while to build up that public confidence in the elected officials so that they'll support what you're trying to do.
I guess I'm going to tell a story because Frank wants us to tell stories up here. This is a fun story because it relates to both of these people to my right and my left. Boeing produces we do an eco-demonstrator, and this is a program that allows us to put a bunch of technologies all onto a different airplane, all related to efficiency, and test them every couple years. And so it really takes away, shortens the time frame between technology to implementation on the airplane. Well, this past year, we used a Boeing 737, which was manufactured in King County, and we put this bug-phobic coating on the edges of the airplane because actually bug residue is a big problem on airplanes, right? It actually decreases the aerodynamics of the airplanes. So then we decided to look for where, and we did this in collaboration with NASA, right? Because like I said, everything's a partnership. So where is the most buggiest place in America? Alabama. So we fly the airplane down to Alabama because we knew we would get the most amount of bugs on there so we could test the technology. And I guess if I was going to, and that's pretty creative, right? So when we are striving for efficiency, we're looking at even micro efficiency on the airplanes, because if an airplane's going to be serving in life for 40 years, because that's typically where airplanes stand today, you want to make sure you can get every single efficiency increase out of that airplane possible. And so that's my story for today.
We have a vast ecosystem in Huntsville.
That's a vast ecosystem.
My closing comment would be based on this theme of storytelling, is think about how you tell these stories and paint a compelling picture for the public, and think about what people care about. If we speak in terms of, commute miles reduced or pounds of CO2, it's not very compelling. But when we start to think about what do you love about the place you live, and I think in King County, people would say, I love the clean water, I love that I can drive 45 minutes and be in the mountain, I love that I can jump on a bike trail, it's a beautiful place. And so we've started to message around things of transit. We've got these big bus ads that say things like, fish love the bus, mountains love the bus. And then you can tell a story that goes with that. If you want to keep those things that you love, if you love farms and forests and trails and open space, we need to have a mobility infrastructure that can support that and can support, where and how we develop. So think about how you tell those stories.
Yeah, I guess, again, with the theme of storytelling, another thing that I think a lot of students think is important is just being aware of stories that aren't getting told, and just thinking about how we can do that better. Because, like a couple of you mentioned, so much of this is a part of people's lives. It's about building a good ecosystem. And I think the way that we see building better cities and more resilient cities is to also look at these stories that aren't getting told and these people whose perspectives might not be incorporated, and thinking about how to do that.
I'll just echo what the administrator said earlier this morning, that the people in this room, and people who already have a passion for sustainability and for making a more livable world and more livable cities, are the people who will do what needs to happen to get us to that place. And so put that passion to use where you can, be it a government setting, be it elective office, be it in a corporation, and I think really exciting things will happen.
Great. Well, we stole a little bit extra time, but I'm glad we got to hear that bug story.
That's okay. I'm glad you did. Thank you very much, and thanks to Cooper. Stay. Couple of summational points I'd like to make. So first of all, Boeing and Uber and every company in America has done a ton of research on their customers, and a lot of the research that they've done is on millennials, right? Yep. You guys are changing everything. Your demands for what these companies do, that they be more sustainable, that they be more transparent, changing. Am I right?
Correct. Yes.
Right? One of the things in the agriculture sector, I know, millennial demands in the marketplace, look at what Chipotle's been through, are forcing people in agriculture to be more sustainable and to explain what their carbon footprint is. Very interesting. Incentives, you talked about incentivizing. You asked about a carbon tax. Actually, there are businesses that are internally doing a carbon tax. Microsoft, for example, is one of them. They pass that through every time they think about something. It's an innovative way they are running their business, anticipating maybe someday public policymakers will pass a carbon tax, though don't hold your breath. Innovation is so interesting in the way it unfolds. So it's everything from the way the Empire State Building was renovated, putting new windows in with argon gas in between. What did it do? It drove its energy costs way down. Clients wanted to be there. It suddenly became an even hotter property, even though it does change the colors because CNN asks it to do so on election night. I don't know how many of you saw that, but it's kind of weird. It's sort of the equivalent of the white smoke coming out of the Vatican after they choose somebody. Stories are really important. So the way I'd tell the Uber story is I take Uber and Lyft, both, sorry. I love talking to cab drivers. So how's the Lyft business going? How's the Uber business? I've had cybersecurity people, actors, people in the military. The people who are driving these vehicles are amazing. Every person is a story. So find a way to tell the story about the person. My wife and I moved into the city a few years ago, right? Boomers and millennials are moving into cities. And I had been out in Virginia. I had been driving for ages. Long drives getting longer. You know what I discovered when I moved into the city? I discovered that I was consuming close to $150 of gas less each month. My insurance on my car went way down because I wasn't driving so much. I didn't need a car very much. I've had the car for almost 6 years. I put on about 22,000 miles in 6 years. So I don't need a new car. My car, and I thought, God, if I'd known that story, if somebody had explained that to me, I might have been able to offset the extra cost of buying or renting a place in the city. So it's how we connect our stories and ourselves, our data and our facts, our expectations to this. So I think this is terrific. Thank you all so much. I'm going to steal the mayor for just a second because we're going to, can you stand up here with me? You're also doing something called, what do you call it, your road diet or something like that?
Road diets, where we talk about going from 5-lane roads down to 3-lane or 4-lane roads, so that you can also do bike ped lanes on there. So it's something that just makes sense as your road
so less
system,
road.
Less road.
For less cars, you hope? Is that the idea, or just to use it more efficiently?
Probably the same number of cars, just as time has changed, your traffic patterns have changed.
And you want to do something with bikes? You're going to mess with what?
Bikes and greenways and green trails.
What, electric bikes?
Looking at electric bikes in the area. One of the things in the South that kind of keeps you from wanting to jump on a bike and ride it, especially in the middle of summer when it's 100 degrees, is that you might sweat by the time you get to your meeting.
And all those bugs.
Nobody will want to be with you.
Right.
So that's one of the things that we look
actually,
at.
Like a bike share thing only?
Bike share, but looking at electric bikes, and we've talked to our Ford dealer and some of the other dealers about it. So it's going to be interesting.
And they're in
to
on
see
that?
what we can do. Not in yet. We're in the talking stage.
And you're doing something with Google. What's that all about?
We are a Google Fiber city. We're one of 10 Google Fiber cities. So it brings fiber to the door of every house in the city of Huntsville. But more important than that, it also gives us a chance to do smart grids in our traffic management, and it gives us some capabilities that we didn't have in both law enforcement and transportation sides that fiber helps drive.
I think one of the reasons the mayor is with us is he's an innovative guy in an innovative city. And we were talking over dinner the other night, and after we made sure that he had way too much to drink, I said, how about hosting a team of students from here? And they could come down and tell your story of innovation in your city. And the mayor agreed. So we are going to have a Planet Forward travel grant for a student reporting team from in this group. And if you're interested, what we'd like you to do is talk to the mayor, talk to me, talk to Dan Reed. Dan, wave your hand, or any of our folks in green T-shirts. And we will take your name, and we're going to ask you to sign up for that. And we're going to figure out we'll probably do an essay or some kind of application process once we know you're interested. And they'll have access to you. Can they hang out with you?
Yes, they will.
You're going to go electric biking around the town or something?
We'll let them come see our
give them bug spray before they do that?
And they can see our big picture, because one of the biggest things that you have to do is you put together these plans. You have to make sure that they interweave within each other. And so we're putting together what we call a big picture, which is a comprehensive plan. And each portion of that has something to do with sustainability, with the economy, how to make sure that your community is a better community. And we'd love to let them see the picture of that and how it all blends together.
That's terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. All right, so it's lunchtime, and here's what we'd like to suggest that you think about. Our tape, Dan, everybody has a tag on the back of their...
Maybe everyone. Check your card.
Check my card. Each lunch table has an appropriate question. Oh, that's something else. Okay, so some of you will have tags on the back of your cards, but seek out a mayor or a panelist or a participant so that you can have a spirited conversation and network and talk to and get to know somebody that you don't already know. A lot of you are from one school. If you guys want to split up, don't all go together. If there are 2 or 3 or 6 of you, split up. okay, so that you can spread out and enjoy the lunch and enjoy the exchange. Now, each lunch table here, I'm going to give you some instructions. Each lunch table has a question on it, reflecting some of the themes we're discussing today. So join a table marked with the same symbol as the one on your name tag. That's how we're marrying you up. Now, someone at your table, a participant or a mayor or one of the professors here or one of our esteemed scientists or our university president will volunteer to be a discussion leader and to help lead the discussion through this informal chat on the topic. Keep your pen out, if you've got a pen, because we'll have blank cards on the table as well for you to jot down your thoughts, come up with some good responses, and we're going to flip through them this afternoon. Ideas about innovations and storytelling and some of the things you've heard here today that we can share back and give to the mayors here to take back to their cities to make them even better places. Anyway, grab a seat, have a great lunch, enjoy the conversation. We'll be back here at 1. Remember, we're going to work toward and end up with our StoryFest prize. And we've got our friends from UNFAO here who are going to distribute it, and lots more on food and others this afternoon. Lunch is right across the way. Follow the signs. Thanks.